Hi everyone, I'm Lisa the Librarian, and I'd love to welcome you into the wonderful world of books. Today, I'll be reading the story Good Night, Good Night by Woodhouse. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. Good night, good night. It is time for bed. Good night, good night. Lay down your sweet head. Good night, good night. You have your soft blanket. Good night, good night. You asked for water and drank it. Good night, good night. You have all of your teddy bears. Good night, good night. We said our bedtime prayers. Good night, good night. I love you so much. Good night, good night. Now is a good time to hush. Good night, good night. I will see you when the sun comes up. Good night, good night. No, you cannot have a little more water in your cup. Good night, good night. I gave you kisses and hugs. Good night, good night. Yes, I tucked you in as snug as a bug. Good night, good night. We read your favorite book. Good night, good night. You enjoyed the bath you took. Good night, good night. I already sang you 3 songs. Good night, good night. No, I am just tired. Nothing is wrong. Good night, good night. I will always, 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 and forever love you. Good night, good night. What is that in your bed? A shoe? Good night, good night. It is now time to get some C's. Good night, good night. No, you cannot have one more piece of cheese. Good night, good night. Remember, I love everything you are. Good night, good night. No, I am not going too far. Good night, good night. It is time to turn off the light. Good night, good night. Yes, it's dark out. You are right. Good night, good night. Angels keep you safe. Good night, good night. No, you cannot have a flashlight just in case. Good night, good night. I love you lots and lots. Good night, good night. Sweet dreams and happy thoughts. Good night, good night. It is time for bed. Good night, good night. The end. Hello, hello. I forgot to brush my teeth. The end. I hope you enjoyed the story. I know I did. See you next time.